Okay, thank you for joining us for today's webinar, Flood Insurance Advice, a practical guide. My name is Carly Hanson and I'm one of the Sector Sustainability Coordinators at Community Legal Centres Queensland. Firstly, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we're holding today's webinar. In Meanjin, Brisbane, they are the Turrbal and the Yagara people. I wish to pay my respect to their elders, past, present and emerging, and acknowledge that these are stolen lands and that sovereignty was never ceded. As today's webinar is being viewed by people throughout Queensland and possibly some interstate as well, in New South Wales most likely, I'd also really like to pay my respects to the traditional owners throughout the country and extend a very warm welcome to any First Nations people who are listening in today. So I'm really pleased today to welcome our presenters who you can hopefully see on the screen. So we have Paul Holmes, who's the Principal Lawyer in the Civil Justice Services at Legal Aid Queensland, and Bridget Burton, Director of the Human Rights and Civil Law Practice at Caxton Legal Centre. So they'll be talking to us today, obviously around the recent weather events in southeast Queensland and in northern New South Wales, and how that has seen thousands of people with homes and cars damaged by storms, rain and flooding. This has obviously led to many consumers needing to lodge insurance claims, and it's likely that in the near future, community legal centres will be approached by many clients who are seeking assistance with their insurance claims as they progress through. So Bridget and Paul will aim to provide a very practical webinar session today on some of the common insurance issues that clients present with and how CLCs may assist these clients in getting the best outcome from their insurance claim. So before I hand over to Bridget and Paul, I just wanted to do a quick bit of housekeeping. So just letting you know that today's webinar is being recorded and we'll have the recording available to download probably this afternoon for you. The PowerPoints have been emailed out to everyone who registered, and they're also available on our website and in the handout section of the GoToWebinar control panel for you to grab. We really encourage you to engage in this session, ask questions and share your experiences. So simply type your question or your comment into the question box on the control panel and we'll read those questions out. So feel free to type them in, when prompted, but also as you think of them through the session. There's also a few polls that our presenters will be running. So when they do appear, please pop your answers in. And I will now hand over to Bridget and Paul to kick us off. Thanks so much.
Hello, everybody. Good afternoon. Thank you for coming along to this. So Paul and I are going to talk to you about insurance disputes, but we're very aware that you may have other questions about other areas of law that have come up for you and your community arising out of the rain and the flood events that we've seen recently. So I would really like to encourage you to put your other legal questions as well as your specific insurance questions into the question box now, because what we will do is adjust the webinar to suit those other things. And if we have questions that we can provide some guidance on, we'll come back to those at the end and Paul will wrap up a bit quicker so that we've got time to deal with all of those questions. The thing that we always try and do when we are talking about like a disaster event is to predict what are going to be the legal issues that come up, and we draw really heavily on our experience for that. So both Paul and I ran flood recovery units in our respective organisations after the 2011 floods and have done bits and pieces on disasters that have occurred in the meantime. Paul's done quite a lot, but there's always things that come up that are different to what you had anticipated. And one of the things that we've noticed from this particular weather event, at least in Brisbane, is that it happened quite suddenly and it happened over a weekend. And what that meant was that there was some very specific things that we weren't predicting that have been that first wave of legal issues that have come through. And a couple of those from my end, and I'll get Paul to talk about what he's seeing, a couple of those from my end are what the first thing was, we have a lot of commercial premises, a lot of industrial premises on the low-lying parts of Brisbane where residential development is probably less less appropriate, and a large number of mechanics in the Oxley, Rockley area in particular, and other types of commercial premises. So people had left vehicles or other goods in a location on Friday expecting them to be fine, and then by Monday they were underwater. So the first wave of problems that have come out is what happens in that situation where I've left something on Friday expecting it to be fine, and when I come to pick it up on Monday it's completely underwater. The other thing that we've been seeing at Caxton, our employment law program, for example, is that a lot of weekend staff were left making decisions about their workplace without being able to get on the phone to their manager, without being able to really know what the framework was for making these kinds of decisions. So we've seen teenage staff members making decisions about things that are maybe above their pay grade. And a large proportion of those decisions have been supported after the fact, but we have started to also see a few come through where there's been a dispute about whether that was the right thing to have done in that context. So quite a different scenario to what we saw in other disasters where those things, simply because it happened on a different day of the week. So please really like to encourage everyone to pop in the question box what other sort of problems you've been seeing. Don't have to be insurance, but we'd really love it if you let us know what specific insurance things you've seen. But they don't have to be insurance if they're employment law or other consumer, bailment, whatever it is. We'll come back to those at the end. So I'm going to pass over to Paul to talk about what he's seen in the early stages. So the first question that has come through for us is about exactly that, an issue about bailment and vehicles. So we'll come back to that. But Paul, what have you seen?
We've also seen the issue around the mechanics, and I think the hard bit around the mechanics one is often it's people who have lower value cars who don't usually or are not usually able to afford comprehensive car insurance, which would have given them an out in this scenario without having to worry about the mechanic. But without that insurance, their only claim is potentially against the mechanic. So there's an interesting discussion, and Hub Legal's raised a good point here. Do you pursue it under Australian consumer law or do you pursue it under bailment? So I think that's something we should come back to at the end, Bridget, and just have a chat about. The other thing we've seen a fair bit of so far is insurance assessors saying really dumb things, like you can't clean up your property until we come and see all of the damaged goods, which is a very different message to the message that insurers themselves are sending. And so that's causing some confusion for people. And that's something that's common in disasters. You'll have insurers saying one thing and a rogue staff member at a third party they've employed to do the work saying something entirely different. It's usually solvable if they get to one of us, but they've got to have the confidence to get to one of us. The other thing I'm expecting to start to appear in the next week or so is we're due to start to see insurance refusals coming through. And I think when that happens, that's when all of us are likely to get a lot of inquiries.
Yeah. The other preliminary thing that Paul and I wanted to cover before we move on to the substantive part of the presentation is that from I guess what we wanted to talk about was a little bit about what's changed in the last few years, so that a lot of us, myself included, our main experience of a similar disaster event to the one we've just had has been the Brisbane floods that happened in 2011. In 2011, we, Caxton and Legal Aid as well, Legal Aid New South Wales and Financial Rights New South Wales, all engaged in litigation the 2 years following with insurance companies that had refused insurance claims. So we're kind of trying to think through, well, what's the same and what's different from that particular event. And we have had other events in the meantime, so we do have a little bit of an idea about how it will play out, but nothing quite like a big widespread metropolitan Brisbane disaster event like this. So I guess the first thing that's the two key things that are different this time compared to 2011. The first one is that in 2011, people upriver were surprised by the water, and obviously that was really tragic in Grantham and in Toowoomba. But by the time the water got to Brisbane, it hadn't been raining for days, really. You know, it's 3 or 4 days later when the water entered most people's properties, and that's what's colloquially referred to as a blue sky flood. And a blue sky flood is really kind of different from one that happens while the rain is still falling. Became important in 2011 because a lot of insurers initially denied the claims on the basis that their policy didn't cover a flood of that character, but they did cover other kinds of inundation like stormwater, rainwater, and flash flooding. So there was a lot of dispute about whether or not, you know, when the water entered the property, what kind of water was it, had some intervening thing happened that made it not rainwater by the time it came to this house or the other house. This time we don't have that. So we've got a water inundation that occurred, and you'll notice that Paul probably won't use the word flood at all, but we had water inundation that occurred while the rain was still falling. The rainfall was extraordinary in some parts of the southeast Queensland, northern New South Wales, being measured in metres over that weekend, which is quite unbelievable. You know, that's climate change and the 10 ensuing years, but we had water that was falling in metres. It's been referred to as a rain bomb. It's been referred to as an atmospheric river, but regardless of which, it was a completely different water event than occurred in 2011. So we think that will be different. The other thing that's changed, of course, is insurance law has changed and insurance policies have changed. So I'm going to pop over to get Paul to deal with that before he gets into the substance of the webinar. We just only have that one question still in relation to car repairs and mechanics. So if anyone else has any other questions, pop them in the question box. But at this stage, Paul, you've got the better part of 45 minutes to deal with your insurance presentation. Thanks.
With insurance. All right. So I guess the starting point about the changes around insurance law is one of the big things that came out of following 2011 is now every insurance policy has the same definition of flood. Part of the reason we had so many fights in 2011 is every single insurance policy had a different definition of what flood actually meant. And so that created options for us to dispute. But where I think the dispute's going to arise in this disaster is while there's a consistent definition of flood, and if you have an RACQ or a Suncorp policy, you have to pay for flood as part of the coverage, most of the other policies don't require you to take out flood cover. So there will be policies, as is highlighted in one of the questions, somebody's got flood cover, not got flood cover, but they do have storm and tempest cover. So what that means in that story is you look at the various insurance policies, and some have a definition of storm, some have a definition of storm water, some have a definition of rainwater, stormwater runoff, storm, all these variations on what a definition of what I'll describe as water runoff means. And so we're all going to have to look at the individual policies to see what the definition is, and then look at, in particular suburbs, what happened to the property and where the water came from, to have a discussion around whether that particular policy covers storm or it doesn't. So in a lot of ways, the fights are going to be very similar, only it's not going to be a fight around a definition of flood. It's going to be a fight around, okay, does the definition of stormwater runoff or stormwater or rainwater cover what happened regarding the water falling from the sky? And I think we've got an argument, particularly in a number of suburbs and in a number of places, that there was significant damage caused to some properties by the rain falling and running off, before any water from the creek or any water from the flood came up. So in that sort of context, that I think is where we're going to start. So I guess the question, and I think the other question that will come up in this story, and it's probably related to the mechanics, is a lot of storage areas or storage places are on low-lying areas. So we're likely to see clients who they might have housing that's not consistent, or they might be struggling to find an affordable place. So they've put their belongings into storage. That storage place has gone underwater and they're now having to make claims. And that's solely going to depend on what's in the storage contract and what sort of insurance the storage place is going to have. The other leftover part of this discussion is there's some people still recovering, and I think I saw one of the financial counsellors online who's done a lot of work in the Springfield area. Some of those places were affected by rainwater runoff and are still recovering from Halloween hailstorms in 2020. And so the combination of those events is worth talking about as well. The other difficulty about all of this is, and I'll just put this on the back burner to discuss at the end, building codes may well have changed in between when people took their insurance out and now. And not all insurance policies, let's say you have a sum insured policy versus a replacement policy on your insurance, it may not cover the costs of rebuilding a home to the standard which meets the new building codes, but we'll park that for a moment. What I'd like to do and what we're planning to do as part of this presentation is jump into a bit of this is the sort of thing you should expect as the insurance recovery process goes along. So if you've got questions as I'm talking, pop them in and we will go through them. Either I might answer them as I go along with Bridget, or we'll cover them at the end. So to jump into the substantive part of the presentation, just to give you a bit of an idea of the scale, and these figures are now nearly 2 weeks old, but as we hit the 10th of March, there were a tick over 118,000 claims lodged from this disaster across New South Wales and Queensland, and that will have increased substantially since then. So just be aware of that. But what I just wanted to talk to you about is what we've seen initially as a part of initial flood response is people will be talking to their mate down the road, they'll be talking to people in the community, they might even ring up an insurance call centre and be told you're not covered for flood, don't bother lodging the claim. And particularly in the context of the event we have here, which is a rain event, and most of your clients won't call it a rain event, they'll call it a flood event. I find it very hard to do that, as Bridget said, but we'll bear with me. Get them to lodge the claim. It's not up to them, it's not up to you, it's not up to us to make that initial decision about whether or not their insurance covers the claim today. That's the insurer's job. And if and when they get a refusal, it's then our job to talk them through, okay, what reasonable chance do you have of disputing this particular refusal? The second thing I think is really important is invariably following these disasters, and they've already been active in affected areas, there are organisations that will come door knocking and say, we can help you manage your insurance claim for a fee. And over the years, we've seen those fees being anywhere between 5 and 20% of the amount of money the person gets from the insurance claim. My issue with that is, what that often means is people can't rebuild the house to the standard that the house originally was if they're trying to rebuild it with 80% of the value. It just doesn't work. The good news I have in that space is these organisations now, as of 1 January, have to be licensed. And so what that means is if somebody is having problems with them, having signed a contract, you can actually go to the Australian Financial Complaints Authority and lodge a complaint about that. I see there's a question in the chat around, does the language used when making a claim make a difference to the outcome? The answer is no, it shouldn't. And we have run claims before successfully where the person might have rung up and said, look, I've been affected by flood, when in reality they've been affected by storm or vice versa. What all that person needs to say is, my house has been damaged, I need to lodge a claim. That's literally all they should have to say. And if people are concerned about that, that to me is the message you give them when lodging a claim. I have had my house damaged, or I've had my car damaged, I want to lodge a claim. It's not up to them to make guesses around what happened, how it happened, anything like that. But if they do, I'm not so worried about that either, because people's experience of what happened to them is actually really important to this story, because their experience of where they saw the water coming from, when it came in and how it came in, is actually really relevant when their experience is different to what an assessor's report about what happened says, because that then gives us the ability to dispute the account of the assessor. And I think that's really important. And we'll come to assessors in a minute. And that's why we say, keep a record of what happened, write it down, take photos for cleaning up, because your client's experience of what happened is just as relevant in my book, evidentiary-wise, as an assessor's report of what happened. Because the reality is the assessor comes back after the event and uses their professional judgment to make a call on what they say happened. But the reality is they weren't there. And so they've only got essentially the debris with which to make a judgment. And if they're not coming until after a lot of those debris have been cleaned up, it can be hard for them to get that call right on what actually happened. So don't be afraid to encourage clients to do that. Isn't that right, Bridget?
Yeah, and I think you might have given people the answer to your first poll.
I did. That's fine.
So you should run the polls at the end of the slide before you give out too many other answers.
I probably should, but that's all right. We'll find out in a minute as to
whether people were listening to you.
Yeah, exactly. So the first one is just who's already experienced issues, and we're seeing maybe about 30% of you so far have already been experiencing issues, increasing a little bit. So that's at an early stage. That's pretty good in terms of where people have been experiencing issues. So I'll just give you a few more seconds and I'll close it off there. So it's about, in round figures, it's about 2/3 haven't seen an issue yet, and 1/3 have. All right, so next poll. We're going to talk about making an insurance claim. Now, I've talked a little bit around lodging the claim and lodging it as soon as possible, but is there actually a time limit within which you have to lodge that claim? And on this one, this one I'm expecting a wide variety of answers, because a lot of ways lawyers are conditioned to there always being a time limit. And in the insurance space, there are a lot of time limits we need to be aware of. But I'll close it off now. The answer to this one, Bridget, of course, is that there is no time limit on making a claim. But For me, this is more a practical question. And the practical question is, the sooner you lodge the claim, the better your recollection is of what happened. The insurer is going to respond more quickly, you get help more quickly. So while there is no time limit, it's really important to get that claim lodged as soon as possible and encourage people to do that. And then finally, we will see who listened to my chat about assessors before. And so far, the good sign is people seem to be listening to me. That's a positive, Bridget.
Yep, that's good news, Paul.
We'll see if everybody's still listening to me at the end.
Yeah, it should be like a pop quiz that we run at the end of the presentation to see whether people were following along. But that's good, I think. Almost everybody's got that one.
So that's...
Yeah.
So we'll just share that quickly. Everybody's got that one. So that's good. I would encourage, though, as I'm talking, if we say something that doesn't make sense or you're not sure about, just pop a question in the chat and we can deal with it as we're going. So to me, that initial flood response is sort of what we're seeing now. And what will happen in the next couple of weeks is we're likely to see other issues. And one of them is the assessor or an insurer or a third party visiting. Now, people are often afraid to ask an assessor questions or say stuff to an assessor because they're afraid it might lead to their claim being denied. That's the reality. And that's why I was talking before about your experience is still important. And the reality of it is the only way the right decision is made is if somebody has all of the information. And that includes your experience of what occurred. It also includes if an assessor is saying something you're not certain about or asking for information you're not certain of, it doesn't hurt to ring somebody up, such as a community legal centre, such as legal aid, and we should expect questions where people go, look, an assessor said this, is it right? So for example, I've already had people ring up saying, assessor told me he will reduce the claim amount if I put all my damaged property on the sidewalk ready to be taken away. This particular client was instructed, you have to keep it on your property in its smelling foul mess until I see it. Now, you and I know that that's wrong and not something an assessor should be saying. But if you're somebody that doesn't have the experience of all of us, you quite rightfully are probably fearful that that would stuff up your insurance claim. Always ensure people have the confidence to ask questions about that, because we've seen that, and we've also seen don't start any work on your property, don't start cleaning out your property at all until an assessor comes. Again, all that's doing is further damaging the property, and arguably means you're not meeting your duty under your insurance policy to mitigate your loss. That's one of the other really important things people forget about in the insurance space, and that is people actually have a duty to mitigate their loss, and that includes cleaning up promptly. And that's why the insurers were saying, look, start cleaning up, but take photos as you're going, because that still gives them the evidence of the damage that occurred and allows them to assess the damage which occurred. And I think that's a really, really important thing for people to remember in this space. So that to me is assessors, and the reality is there are people who've been told they're not getting an assessor for 2 or 3 weeks. So there's a likelihood that we're going to see those questions continuing to come through. The next stage of that, and please keep popping the questions in as we're going, the next stage of that looks at what happens when there's a refusal, because people have lodged their claim, the insurers have taken some time to assess it, and it comes back. And people are told you're not covered. The reality of the next step is all insurers have an internal dispute resolution area of the insurer. And my experience is people are, on the whole, pretty distrusting of internal dispute resolution areas because they say, oh, they're still part of the insurer. Look, the reality of an internal dispute resolution area is they are an entirely separate department of the insurer whose job is to review, independently of the earlier decision, what's happening on that particular claim. The reality of the decision making they do is if all somebody says is, I disagree with the decision, which is an entirely reasonable thing to do, that's not really going to change many insurance refusals unless the initial decision maker just completely missed a point. So part of what I encourage around IDR for all of us when people are talking to us about that is to ask questions like, okay, so you might disagree. Tell me why you disagree. What's wrong about their interpretations of what happened? What evidence have you heard from people in your community that shows what they're saying is wrong? Because that sort of information is what can lead to an internal dispute resolution area changing an insurance refusal. But if you're unsuccessful in that space, the step after that is to lodge a complaint with the Australian Financial Complaints Authority. And once you have an IDR decision, your time limit there is 2 years. So just be aware of that in the background as we're going. I noticed there's a question coming in the chat around should cleanup be provided by the insurance company? What are reasonable timeframes? And look, what often happens in that space is debris removal and things like that is a part of some policies and it's not a part of others. And so often what you need to work out is, okay, is that part of the coverage? And have a look at what cleanup options the government is offering. Because I know one of the things following the bushfires is the New South Wales and Victorian governments had slightly different approaches to the debris removal and cleanup. And that made it harder for the insurers to work out, okay, which bit of this are we funding and how are we doing it? So it's important to ask an insurer those questions. Okay, what options do I have around debris removal and cleanup? What bit of it's covered and what is not? The other thing I would say about it though is the thing about debris removals is if there are people available, whether it be Mud Army or otherwise, who are willing to help a client clean up, I would take advantage of that offer, but I would record the damage before I cleaned up. To me, that's the important key. Bridget, did you have something to add there? Nope. Cool. All right, so that to me is the issue around cleanup. But the reasons for refusal, I think, are really key here. And we talked a lot about where the water came from. There is now a consistent flood definition, but there's not a consistent definition around stormwater and stormwater runoff. So what that's going to mean is collectively we're going to read a lot of hydrology reports and we're going to read a lot of assessors' reports. The key bit about those for me is on what evidence are these people basing their decision? Because that's what we're picking at. You don't necessarily need, and this happened a lot in 2011, dueling assessors' reports or dueling expert reports to win. What you need are people's experience, which shows the evidence being relied on by the assessor or by the hydrologist isn't quite right. And that is helpful for our clients because most of our clients can't pay the 5 or 10 grand or however much money it is to get a second report. And it also means that accessing a hydrologist or accessing an assessor who isn't already employed by an insurer is actually really hard. Nearly all of them rely on the insurers for their business and so have a conflict in doing reports for our clients. That's just the reality of the insurance industry. The final thing, and this is a pet bugbear of mine, if anybody gets an insurance refusal based on wear and tear and maintenance, please let me know, because habitually insurers are really bad at picking one line out of an assessor's report that might say, oh, there was a tile missing here, or there was a nail missing there, or the property wasn't maintained properly, and using that as a basis for denying an insurance claim. My view on this is, if somebody's going to deny a claim on the basis of wear and tear and maintenance, what they need to actually do is say, okay, the property wasn't maintained properly. What should have happened is X, Y, Z. The difference that would have made to the damage is X, Y, Z. And it's that last step that isn't followed through in those reports. Because in a lot of these instances, and I'll use cyclones as an example, one tile missing from the roof wasn't going to stop the roof being lifted off in 250k an hour winds. And so there's no actual basis, in my view, for denying a claim in that story. And so in a flood or rainwater event, when we're experiencing what my mother compared to monsoon conditions when she grew up in Cairns, properties in Brisbane and properties in southeast Queensland aren't built for the monsoon. What they're built for is southeast Queensland and storms. And so if you've got a property that's being damaged because the torrent of water was simply too much, that's not a basis for denying a claim on the basis of wear and tear. And that should always be disputed. So if people get those and they want to talk that through, I'm open to phone calls so we can have a discussion. The other bit that I wanted to talk about then, and we've been through most of this, is temporary accommodation. Now, temporary accommodation is really important, but what people are going to experience is there's a shortage of housing pretty much everywhere before the floods occurred in the affected areas. And I'm thinking southeast Queensland, I'm thinking northern New South Wales. And so actually getting access to a property to live in, people are finding hard. So most insurance clauses policies have temporary accommodation in them. I would be encouraging people to ask the insurer for as long a lease, booking in as long a lease as they can. And the reason I'm saying that is some of these properties are going to take 12, 18 months, 24 months to fix, and locking in a long-term rental in that space is really important for people's mental health and peace of mind. And it was one of the problems that arose in the Halloween hailstorm up here. People were getting temporary accommodation for a couple of weeks at a time and having no certainty about where they were living, and often having to move regularly. And that didn't assist them in their recovery. So be aware of temporary accommodation and the importance of people getting that right. Now, the other thing I wanted to talk about is what happens if a claim is accepted. And to me, there are a couple of big issues here. There are a shortage of building materials and qualified tradespeople. So that means even if people's claims are accepted, there's often going to be the problem that it's still going to take a while to fix these properties. And people following a disaster, all they want to do is get back home. And unfortunately, I don't think any of us are going to have that cure-all that will allow them to do that. So be aware for trauma, that's going to cause people trauma and may see them lashing out on us. And there's just simply no fix for it. The other thing is around scope of works. There's a bit of a misnomer out there around scope of works that it has to be perfect before an insurer starts work to fix your property. It doesn't. The reality of rebuilds is it's often only when you start the rebuild that other problems with the property, you become aware of them and then you can fix them. And what happens in that story is if you see further damage, you ring up the insurer and you get them to add it to the scope of works. And if they don't, you follow the process through the internal dispute resolution area and AFCA. The third thing is cash settlements. cash settlements are really attractive for people, and they're really attractive because it means they don't have to deal with the insurer anymore. It causes problems though, because people no longer have their repairs guaranteed, and they grossly underestimate how much work it takes to get 10 different tradesmen to the property to do the work at the right time and in the right order. And that's something that insurers are very experienced at doing. The other thing at the moment is, unless somebody is saying, I don't want to rebuild my house at all, or they've got a builder's license, I really struggle to see when it's going to be a good alternative for people to accept a cash settlement. Because if insurers can't get enough builders to do the work or enough building materials to do the work quickly, member of the public's got no chance. So I'd just be really conscious of ensuring and trying to encourage people to get advice around cash settlements before accepting them. Because while they might appear to be an easy fix, they often end up with a huge amount of other work. Now I'm thinking, Bridget, that's probably a good place to stop and deal with some of the questions, do you think?
Yeah, I was just going to follow on from what you were saying there, though. In the last, when we did the litigation in 2012, 13,
Yep.
it was all about liability. All of the real dispute was around liability, but once you established that the insurance covered it, then it tended to be that people were adequately dealt with from there. So we would close files at the end once the insurance claim had been found, like once the insurer had been told they had to accept that claim. We were not really dealing a lot with the scope of works or the amount that a person might get, because those things were quite straightforward. I personally think that's where the work is going to be this time. I'm not anticipating huge volumes of disputes around liability like what we had on that occasion. It's just not that same event. But I think that the amounts are going to be really different. Anyone who has tried to do any building work over the last 2 years has had to put in their hand in their pocket for many times more than what they thought they were going to spend, because the scarcity of all of the resources needed to do that work. So I think that that's going to be an issue for insurers. The scale of this event through northern New South Wales and all the way through southern Queensland, and that scarcity exacerbated the amounts that people are going to be able to get, or that they're going to need in order to fix the damage, is going to be quite different. And that's where I've been thinking the work will probably really exist, not just for you or anyone else who runs a specialist disaster recovery program, but for all of the local CLCs, the fin counsellors, the people on the ground who are dealing with people. That's what the issues are going to be. It's really important that we don't forget about those in this event. Yeah,
I think that's right. And I'm noticing that there's a couple of questions around, do insurers build back a property like for like? And that feeds into the discussion around a sum insured policy versus a replacement policy, doesn't it?
Well, yes, I think that is, obviously if you've got those different kinds of policies, and I think it's the same, not just for building, but also for contents. A lot of people have, policies, contents insurance policies, including lots of tenants, like what I am, contents insurance policies that aren't really good at replacing actually the things that you have. I think that's something that will be difficult to navigate for a lot of people. Do you want to deal with that specifically about the scope, the difference between sum insured and
So in a nutshell, if you have a replacement policy, the policy will replace like for like. If you have a sum insured policy, it will, as a contents example, it will replace contents to the value of whatever you have the sum insured for. And the same idea for a property. If you have a sum insured policy that's $300,000, that allows you to rebuild a property valued at $300,000. It doesn't allow you necessarily to rebuild back a property to the original condition you had. Now, some people might have put in a sum insured policy because they've decided they might be empty nesters who've decided that if the property is damaged, they're happy to rebuild their smaller property. But for most people, sum insured policies don't necessarily help, and they cause problems. And I see Nicole, who works in Victoria, had issues with this regarding the bushfire ratings. It doesn't take account of changes in bushfire ratings or building codes that require you to rebuild properties to a higher standard. Even if it's an expensive policy, it doesn't always address that. And it's a similar issue regarding wanting to put in flood mitigation and resilience measures as you're rebuilding a property. That's not necessarily covered by your insurance policy and might be something that a person might have to fork out for in addition to the insurance payout, because that's not usually covered.
There are some council schemes that will help people with those resilience, building resilience for future disaster events. So I think it's also worthwhile looking at what else is out there in addition to the insurance for those things. If it's not covered, where else might that resourcing come from?
Yeah, it's insurance. And I think initially in North Queensland, there was recently a scheme around that as well. But it's something I always ask the question of whichever council I'm in or the state government, is there something that can help me if I'm somebody in that disaster space who's been affected?
Yeah.
And there's a question on the cash settlements. If people are planning to relocate rather than rebuild in the same place, then cash settlements might be a legitimate option, Bridget. But I always check in that space, is there a mortgage on the property? Because if there's a mortgage on the property, there's potential problems with a cash settlement, isn't there, Bridget?
Well, yeah, but I think that it's I think that sitting back from that, just if you've done your due diligence, you've checked with your insurer, you've checked with your bank, your lender, and the amount that you receive will be sufficient to pay out the mortgage, those kinds of things that you need to deal with, like those financial things you need to deal with. I mean, we were talking about this before we started, what would be the appropriate circumstances in which you would say, okay, well, a cash settlement's probably worthwhile. And one of those was if the person really did not want to rebuild and there was no drive to rebuild on the property, they're going to not achieve a great sale if the property is really badly damaged, and they, as you said, maybe in breach of their lending criteria, the lending rules for their property. But they, it is an option. It is an option in that situation that it wouldn't exist in others. But I think, I don't know, I think if you've given a choice, a cash settlement at the moment is a big punt.
Yep.
And I think in terms of clients saying, should I or shouldn't I, from a legal perspective, you don't give financial advice, but you'd have to probably point out, well, I mean, really, how do you know what it will actually cost to do what it is that you are planning to do? Because I think people can't, I think things are about to get considerably more expensive. And I think if it was me, I definitely wouldn't be.
Agreed.
Yeah. To get a loan or a building loan. Someone else was, sorry, I'm just going back to the chat. Someone put a comment. They might need to get a loan for their next property or a building loan if they use the payout to pay the balance of their mortgage. Yeah, that's right. So I think it's a loss, isn't it, in that case?
There's also the potential that some mortgage contracts require any cash settlement to be paid to the lender who holds the mortgage. So it's really important that people have that conversation with whoever the lender is for their mortgage before they accept anything.
Did you want to deal quickly with the bailment versus the Australian consumer law issue? So this is the question that a couple of people have had in the chat. If an item, a good, a car, or items left in storage were damaged in that location over that weekend, and can you bring a claim under the Australian Consumer Law, or do you have to do a bailment claim? And now, for people in Queensland, if it's going to be different in different states, the answer to this question, but in Queensland, this is a difficult question because a bailment claim goes through the regular court system. It's more expensive, more complicated, and is a considerably more difficult and more risky prospect than a consumer claim, which goes to the Civil and Administrative Tribunal and is dealt with through a relatively low risk, low cost and simple process. So you've already had a few of these, Paul. What have you been telling people to do?
Look, I've been giving the option, because there's the option of bringing arguably a consumer guarantee type claim under the Australian Consumer Law, saying that they haven't provided a service, and to me that's looking after the car properly when it's in their care as part of providing that service, or going under the bailment tract. The attraction to me about Australian consumer law is the QCAT option, and the fact that people can bring a claim potentially in QCAT without having to pay a lawyer or without having to run a court case as a self-rep. I actually think potentially the bailment claim legally is a touch stronger, but practically most of our clients won't be able to run a bailment claim. So to me, that's the weighing up and the discussion I've been having with clients. This one might be slightly stronger, but it's going to be harder for you. This one might be slightly easier, but legally it's weaker. And you've got to leave that ultimate call with them.
Yeah, I think that's true. And I think the one thing to look out for is that, you know, if they've left their stuff at a mate's place, or they've left it at their mum and dad's, then those are going to be bailment type issues. I don't think anyone's going to sue their parents, but they may have a question over why their friend did not lift their items up off the floor when they could have done. And that's a classic kind of bailment dilemma about looking after the goods of somebody else who's left those things with you. Different again if your goods have been left in a tenancy, or if your goods have been left in, I can't even think of other scenarios where your goods might have been left. Depending on the context, the cause of action might be different. But yes, bailment, it has the advantage of clearly covering the scenario and the disadvantage of being a really difficult action to bring.
Yep, I agree with that.
And it's a bailment even if you're not paying for it. That's the action that exists. So it's and it'll be different. It's those are state laws. How the state manages those, it's going to be different in other states. I know we've got people from New South Wales and Victoria, so just to flag, you'll need to go through a separate process to work out what's the right way for you.
Yes. And I know there's a question that's come through around people with clients, and I'm assuming this might be from a financial counsellor who has scope of works and wanting them to be perfect. Get them in touch with a legal service, because the answer is it doesn't have to be perfect, and you can add to it when you come across more damage. That's the reality of the process. And if they need to hear that from a lawyer to be convinced, we give that advice all the time, don't we, Bridget?
Yes, we do. And I want to quickly, there's one other question that's in there about tenancy. So this question says that my neighbours are tenants and got flooded. Their landlord has only come out once, hasn't done any cleanup or emergency repairs, is refusing to lower the rent. They have had to move back in, their bathroom's not working. There is, on the street that my office is on in South Brisbane, there's a whole building full of tenants with no power, and they haven't had power, well, it's now a month, almost a month. So the Tenants Queensland organisation have put out some excellent fact sheets around tenancy in this situation. Basically, you want to get your clients very quickly some tenancy advice, because they've got 4 weeks from the event, if the property is unlivable, to do it to have the matter to get out of the lease on the basis that the property is unlivable. So very urgent tenancy advice on the first instance. If they are wanting to return back to the property, it is the landlord's responsibility to do the cleanup and to repair everything. And I'm sure that most people are aware of that. Getting the landlord to do that sometimes is not as simple as pointing that out. again, I would be going to Tenants Queensland with that and seeing what assistance I could get, because it's sometimes a little bit of pressure is needed and sometimes a lot, and they'll be able to guide you through that process, so through the RTA and on into QCAT if necessary, to get the landlord to do that. And that's the same for a rent reduction. Sometimes it's not forthcoming, but there are options to pursue that if it doesn't arise.
Now, the remaining questions we've got in there, Bridget, we really can't help with the fact that people have used a lot more water and energy in cleaning up. That might be something you talk to your energy provider about, some hardship if you get a big bill. But beyond that, legally, there's not a whole lot of options available, is there?
No, I don't think that would be. But I think that most energy companies will be pretty sympathetic to people, and that's not just energy companies. If people are having difficulty with any of the costs or any of their expenses, if it's got to do with if you've got a phone contracts, energy companies, credit cards, home loans, if you can't pay your home loan because you've been flooded, hardship variations are available for all of those things. And we are particularly reminding people about, in particular relation to hardship variation for your home loan. If you had one last year because of COVID and now you need another one because of the flood, that's okay to ask again for another hardship variation. And to keep on requiring these companies to come up with the solutions that you need. And if you can't get what you need from directly from a lender or another provider, there are often ombudsman options. So for your lender, that's AFCA. For your telco, that's TIO, and so on and so on. You can refer your clients for legal advice or refer them directly to those ombudsman services. They need it.
And Mary from Tenants Queensland has helpfully reminded us that there's a standard letter on their website that allows people to request a rent decrease due to flood damage and loss of amenity. So
yeah, it's always the first issue.
Yeah, so if you haven't looked at the Tenants Queensland website, it's well worth a look for those sort of standard letters. Now, looking at the remaining questions, Bridget, noticing we're very short of time.
I think we've done pretty well. I think we've got through most of them.
The answer around the assessor visiting is you've just got to wait until the report comes back, because the claim will either be refused or it'll be approved, and depending on whether it is or not governs the next step legally. And the answer about recent renovations you haven't told the insurer about is, in nearly every example, no coverage, because they don't know it's there. Because you've agreed under an insurance policy to insure a particular house. If it's now different, arguably that has changed what's being insured, and you should have disclosed that to the insurer. Any other thoughts, Bridget, before we call it a day?
No, the last question was about affordability, and that is just the everlasting, isn't it? The everlasting problem is that insurance has become significantly more expensive and will continue to become more expensive as you know, we are on the front line really here of the effects of changing climate, and that is just, it is going to continue to bite.
And it's conceivable at some point in the near future, and this has already happened in America, there will be properties for which banks will not write a mortgage for, because the flood or other type of weather risk is so great that it's too great a risk for them to write a mortgage. So
that's a cheery note to end on, Paul.
We have been full of great cheer today. But I guess the other thing worth saying is, if people have questions that occur to them afterwards, feel free to get in contact with us, because we're both happy to answer those type of questions that sort of pop in, ruminating over what we've said.
Absolutely. And we remember that, you know, if you get those quirky things, the employment law or those other sorts of things, just they can mainly also be dealt with also by legal aid or Caxton or your local CLC. I think that the fact that this problem has existed in lots of different pockets has meant that you know, we're all going to be referring to each other for different things. So we're happy to take calls, happy to point you in the right direction. that's what's
Absolutely.
needed.
Excellent. All right. Thank you, everyone, for being such an attentive audience. And I'm sure we'll be in touch with all of you over the course of this recovery process.
Thanks so much, Paul and Bridget. Great conversation, and thank you everyone for your excellent questions. Hopefully you've got a bit more information there to get you going. We will have quite a few other webinars coming up in this series, so please do keep an eye out for them. We're just scheduling and booking them as we can, and they will cover some of the issues that you've raised today around tenancy, employment, other insurance issues, etc. But if there's anything in particular that you're seeing that we aren't covering, please do reach out also to Community Legal Centres Queensland, and we can see what we can do around getting some help out to you. But for now, I'll finish up today's webinar, and thank you again to Paul and Bridget for your time and expertise in this area. A great one to kick our series off with, I think. So there will be a short quiz when I close the session, so please do pop your comments in there, and we'll take it from there. So thanks everyone. Have a great afternoon, and all the best.